All right. Good evening again, everyone, and welcome to the Theodore Roosevelt Inaugural Site's online speaker night. For those of you who don't already know me, my name is Lenora Henson. I'm the Deputy Director at Theodore Roosevelt Inaugural Site, and I want to thank you all for joining us. I especially want to say thank you to all of the TR site members who are with us this evening. Your support is always appreciated, but even more so in the context of the pandemic and all of the uncertainty that comes along with it. The Theodore Roosevelt Inaugural Site in Buffalo, New York is delighted that the magic of Zoom has allowed us to continue our monthly speaker night series during the pandemic. Speaker Night is our opportunity on the fourth Tuesday of most months to invite experts to help us think about some of the issues that were important during TR's presidency and continue to be relevant today. I can't think of a more relevant or enduring issue than tonight's topic, Black America and the Presidents. I'm thrilled to be welcoming author and activist Margaret Kimberly to our Speaker Night series. It's such an honor to have her here with us. We could not do this, however, without the generous financial support of our series sponsors. So our thanks go out to Erie County and the New York State Council on the Arts, NYSCA. I also have to thank the Buffalo Presidential Center and the Niagara Falls Underground Railroad Heritage Center, who are co-sponsoring this evening's presentation. We're delighted to be working with such wonderful partners, and joining me on the panel from these organizations, we have Linda Burgans, who serves as the president of the Buffalo Presidential Center's Board of Trustees. She'll be introducing our speaker in just a few moments. We also have with us Michaela Howard, who is one of the amazing museum educators at the Niagara Falls Underground Railroad Heritage Center. She'll be facilitating our Q&A at the end of the presentation. And I have to say a very special thanks to Michaela, who agreed to fill in at the very last minute for one of her colleagues who had a family emergency. So Michaela, we really appreciate you joining us this evening on such short notice. The final person on our panel is Travis Stratka, who is the TR Site's programming assistant and designated technology troubleshooter. All right, with that, I am going to turn things over to Linda from the Buffalo Presidential Center. I'm going to turn off my video and let Linda introduce tonight's speaker. Linda.
I'm so honored to welcome and introduce tonight's speaker, Margaret Kimberly. Ms. Kimberly is a writer and a peace and justice activist. She's co-founder, editor, and senior columnist for the Black Agenda Report. Her work has also been published in Counterpunch, Consortium News, Common Dreams, the Dallas Morning News, and she's a contributor to the anthology In Defense of Julian Assange, published in 2019. She's a recipient of the Sienna Shim Award for Uncompromised Integrity in Journalism. This honors non-mainstream journalists who tell challenging truths in difficult areas. Prejudential, Black America and the Presidents is a work that does just that. As Ms. Kimberly explains, this book is an effort to shed light on the truth. To the extent that our leaders embody aspects of who we are as a people, studying how each president has participated in our nation's complicated and often shameful treatment of Black people is as good a place as any to start. Before turning the evening over to Ms. Kimberly, I thought I'd share a few quotes from online book reviews of Prejudential. These are from regular readers, not professional reviewers. One person said, "No American should vote in another election without reading this book." Another wrote, "Kimberly is all about the succinct truth. This book is a useful find, especially for educators brave enough to employ it." Still another said, "Kimberly counters the imbalance perpetuated by presidential historians and American mythmakers. This book will be an uncomfortable read for white Americans, but it is a necessary one. Only by confronting and acknowledging the truth of racism can the nation heal and unite." And finally, this from one reviewer: make America great again? No, make America look, make America confess. So with those insights from 4 of her appreciative readers, I'm pleased to turn the program over to Ms. Kimberly.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Linda. I want to, first of all, thank the Theodore Roosevelt site, Theodore Roosevelt inaugural site, National Heritage. Anyway, I'm sorry, it's a mouthful. But as I was saying before we began, I visited Buffalo once and unfortunately didn't get to go, but it's interesting that being in that place where his presidency began accidentally. The book Prejudential began after I watched a PBS documentary. It's funny, the entire book, I have to say I owe it to Theodore Roosevelt. I watched a PBS documentary about the Roosevelts, and I felt that it was too deferential to him, to Theodore Roosevelt. And as a part of my political growth, excuse me, I was a history major, and came of age and into adulthood, having respect for most of the people in the office. But as I learned more, I had, frankly, less and less. Anyway, I watched this this documentary, and I wrote about it in my column in Black Agenda Report. A friend and supporter said to me, "Why don't you write a book about all the presidents?" And I didn't. It was my first effort at writing a book, and I didn't really know what I was getting into. Although sometimes in life we have to, I believe, do some things that are challenging that we don't realize what we're getting into. So that's how it all began in 2014, 2015 with Theodore Roosevelt. So I will begin. Oh, I want to thank, I always say this, I want to thank Cornel West. I was very fortunate to get him to do a blurb. He's a very generous man. And I also always express my appreciation for him. And I'm assuming anybody who is watching this knows that Theodore Roosevelt became president as a result of the assassination of President McKinley in Buffalo. And so I decided to start, even though the story begins with McKinley, with a man named Parker, James Benjamin Parker. He was at the site of the assassination. He grabbed Zolgash, and someone correct me about pronouncing his name, the assassin, after he fired 2 shots and was about to fire a third, and he tackled him. And he became a very famous man for a while after the assassination. Black people then, as now, are always very proud when one of us does something that is seen as positive. There were rumors at the time that McKinley's bodyguards were busy watching Parker, who was a waiter, who he wanted to see the president and happened to be there at that moment, and didn't notice the assassin until the shots were fired. And Parker became very famous in the Black community. And he said, I'm a Negro, and I'm glad that the Ethiopian race has whatever credit comes with what I did. If I did anything, the colored people should get the credit. And for a while, he was a prominent person, but he was not asked to testify at the trial. And his statement was ignored. And for a while, he gave speeches to mostly Black audiences. But he had a very sad ending to his life, became an alcoholic and died in a psychiatric facility. And his body wasn't claimed, and it ended up being dissected by medical students. So this man is at the start of Roosevelt's presidency. Now, I chose these quotes about from that Roosevelt, the things he said about Black people, and they are contradictory. He was a person of contradiction, as most human beings are. He was an avowed white supremacist. He did speak quite often about the superiority of the white race, about the need for white women to have more babies and make sure there were more white people. He actually said things like that. I didn't have all the quotes there. But at the same time, he did things that were seen as beneficial to Black people. Now, he was a Republican, as you know, and many people don't realize that the Republican Party at that time, and for many more decades, was seen as the Black People's Party. It was the party of Lincoln. The Democratic Party was the party of the Jim Crow South. And from the time of the Civil War and afterwards, those black men in the North who could vote all voted Republican. And that short moment when Black people in the South were able to vote, all voted Republican. And we see here that Roosevelt spoke of the need for, if not equity, a kind of fair treatment for Black people. Now, at the time, this was the tail end of Reconstruction. Black people, I'll talk about Booker T. Washington in a second, depended on Republicans for whatever fair treatment they could expect for those prominent Black people to get high positions. And anytime a Republican won, there was great relief among the Black community, just as now, it's just the opposite for the Democrats. So we see him saying, making statements about the need to treat people well, not to treat people based on their race. But at the same time, he would say things like Black people aren't worthy to vote. The Black troops, some of whom were in Cuba, in the ride up San Juan Hill, he claimed they were shirkers and ran away in battle. And he said that Black people were stupid. So there's two sides of him, but we will see that when it came to politics, he sided with white people against Black people, and did some very shameful things because it was politically expedient. And that is the point of my book, that anti-Black racism is foundational. And even today, even when the Black People's Party, now the Democrats, win, it never hurts to for any politician to campaign on using racist tropes, as we saw with the previous president, our most immediate previous president, Trump, although Biden also has a history of racism too, it has to be said. So this is, I have this in the wrong order. I'll go back to that. This is Booker T. Washington, a man whom I'm sure many people know about. He, at the turn of the last century, in the early 20th century, he was the most important Black man in the country. He was the president of Tuskegee University. He was a prodigious fundraiser. He was the patronage king. Any Black person who wanted a decent job had to go through Booker T. Washington. Politicians spoke to him, worked with him. He gave his famous speech at the Atlanta Exposition in the late 1890s. And to keep it rather simple, he said that Black people should not strive for social equality, which we think of as integration today, but should settle for being not to fight for equality, not even necessarily to fight for the franchise, but he was an accommodationist. And this made him a very popular man, made him personally wealthy. And Roosevelt, in his first year in office in 1901, that October, thought he should invite him to dinner. So the same man who said these very racist things was an admirer of Booker T. Washington, as many people were at the time. And there was a firestorm of protests. Neither man was prepared for the level of vitriol directed at both of them. I'll just give you a couple of examples. The Richmond Times raged that Roosevelt advocated that Negroes shall mingle freely with whites in the social circle, that white women may receive attentions from Negro men. Mississippi Senator James Vardaman called Roosevelt, quote, a coon-flavored miscegenationist. And so on and so on. And it went on and on and on. And Washington was criticized. He was also a controversial figure among Black people, because while he was advocating for other Black people not to push for integration, he accepted an invitation to the White House. And even after this storm, the two of them saw each other again at a dinner at the Yale Club just a few days later. The Roosevelt White House didn't know what to do. They kept changing their story. So first they said, yes, they had dinner. Then they said, well, it wasn't really dinner, it was just a luncheon. And then it was, well, Mrs. Roosevelt wasn't there. The daughter wasn't there. It was, there were no white ladies around Booker T. Washington. Washington continued to support Roosevelt past the time that he should have, because a Republican president was considered to be having a Republican president was considered to be the best political situation that Black people could expect. Now, this is a funny story. I hope you can read this. This was the president's secretary, the day after the dinner, that he said the president wants the executive mansion to now be known as the White House. It wasn't always called the White House. It was called the executive mansion, the president's house. There was no official name. You can see at the top, it says executive mansion. Now, there are people who've said that he used the word white to protect himself after the fallout from the dinner with Booker T. Washington, but it's only the next day, so I'm not too sure. But at any rate, it's an interesting story, part of the story. So after 1901, after he faced this denunciation for having invited Booker T. Washington to the White House, he would still do the things that most Republican presidents could be expected. For example, this lady here is Minnie Cox. She was appointed a postmistress. Should I just say postmaster? I don't know, seems kind of archaic. But anyway, by Benjamin Harrison, reappointed by McKinley. But at this time, in the early 1900s, she was threatened, feared for her life, and fled the town. But Roosevelt protected her and kept her in office until her term ended. And there's another example and these were people who depended on Booker T. Washington also for their positions. A man named William Crum, who was a physician, who was appointed to the position of collector of customs for the port of Charleston in 1902. And as I added this quote from the New York Times, where the Times makes it clear that this was offensive to white people and therefore should not have happened. Roosevelt tried to have it both ways with Crum, however. He kept making this recess appointment, and Crum, because of some technicality, wasn't even paid for the job. So Roosevelt had it both ways. Yes, I'm going to keep him in his job, but no, he's not getting paid. But I think it's interesting to always to see what newspapers at a certain point in history were saying. We may think of the New York Times as being liberal now, but if you look at the things they've said throughout history, they were not friendly to Black people. If you look at, for example, the things they said about Martin Luther King when he was still alive. But anyway, so, and there's Roosevelt in Tuskegee in 1905, he and Booker T. Washington. So while he may have retreated after this dinner, Washington maintained his friendship with Roosevelt. Excuse me. And this is what Washington said about the criticism he faced from some Black people for his continuing to support Roosevelt. He said, "The enemy will try to blame me for this. I cannot, without being disloyal to our friend, who I mean to stand by throughout his administration. The bulk of the Negro people are more inclined to reach the decision in dismissing the soldiers at Brownsville. He has favored them in 9 cases out of 10. So here I had, and I apologize for having this out of order. This is a photograph of the 25th Regiment of Buffalo Soldiers who fit into this story when they were assigned to Brownsville, Texas in July of 1906. Their presence, it was 167 men. Their presence was not wanted by the local townspeople. They were accused of committing all kinds of crime. At one point, their commanding officer ordered them to just stay at their post and not even go into the town. In August of that year, they were accused of murder. There were a lot of shots fired, someone was killed, and they immediately were blamed. Now, their commanding officer defended them from the very beginning and said they were all on base. None of these men were outside of their fort and therefore could not have been responsible. And this is started another part of Brownsville. Sorry about the order here. But anyway, so this was 1906. People, as I said, in Brownsville, Texas, blamed the men, and Roosevelt got political advantage out of joining them. So you can see in this cartoon, says, I believe, at the top, he's saying, I believe in the square deal to a group of Black people. And then he says all the officers, all the men in this 25th Infantry Regiment were discharged from the Army. And he did it by executive order. It was very unusual that he took this direct involvement in the case. And he waited until after Election Day, 1906. He waited till it was November, shortly after Election Day, discharged all of them. They were not eligible for pensions. Some of them had been in the military for more than 20 years. And they were summarily kicked out, deprived of pensions, deprived of their pay, dishonorable discharge, were not allowed to, although a couple of them apparently did manage to re-enlist and were kicked out of the military. And this also created a huge controversy. Black people, and this is one of my points in the book, this is something that unfortunately does not change, that as a group, we are dependent upon the largesse of politicians. So these are some quotes from some African-American newspapers at the time and individuals that in reaction to his kicking these men out of the army, that he was a traitor, that he had let Black people down, he's deserted colored people altogether, he's prejudiced against Black people. And this was the reaction in general across the country from Black people after Roosevelt kicked these men out of the army. But they did have their defenders. A man named Benjamin Foraker, who was a Ohio senator. He's one of the few people who insisted that they be treated justly, that they have their day in court, that they be able to testify, that they be able to question their accusers. And he insisted for quite a while, to the detriment of his own career, as it turned out, that Roosevelt had done a great injustice to these men. Now, Roosevelt and Foraker met at, there was something called the Gridiron Dinner in Washington. And it was like, what is it called now? The Al Smith dinner in that usually takes place before a presidential election, and people show up in white tie and they make jokes about each other, and it's supposed to be something politicians have to do. So this was something that took place at the time. This was January of 1907, a couple of months after Roosevelt took action. And Foraker was at the dinner also. And unfortunately, there are disputes about what was said, but there is a consensus that they argued with each other and that Foraker insulted Roosevelt, who responded in anger. And he insisted that he had done the right thing. Some of these men were butchers. They ought to be hung. It's not the business of Congress. If they try to reinstate them, I will veto it. I'll pay no attention. I welcome impeachment. He really hung tough on this punishment. And as I said, by waiting till after Election Day, they got Black votes for congressional seats in that 1906 election, but which he would not have gotten had he taken the action before. Let's see. And I'm sorry, I think there was something. Nope, I'll just keep going. So that was the reaction. Foraker hung tough, and Foraker, at the time, senators were not directly elected. They were appointed by governors. And Roosevelt saw to it that he wasn't reelected. He ruined his political career. But to his credit, Foraker never wavered from what he had said was an injustice. Now, this is something, and this was 1906 was the same year. The presidents had an annual message in December. It's the precursor to the State of the Union address. And I'm going to read this. This is, it's kind of long, but I'm going to read some portions of it. Hold on. And as you can see there, and lynching was rampant at the time. It was quite common. Black people lived in a state of terror, and not just in the South either, by the way. But you can see here that he said the greatest cause of lynching is Black men committing rape. And rape is worse than murder. And mobs frequently avenge the commission of this crime by themselves torturing to death the man committing it, thus avenging in bestial fashion a bestial deed and reducing themselves to a level with the criminal. And he goes on to say, he goes on and on and on, talking about how lynching is caused by rape, and also condemning Black people to to behave themselves, so to speak. So anyway, he says, moreover, when any crime committed by a member of one race against a member of another is avenged, the whole race is attacked. And it's a lot of double speak. Treat each man, whatever his color, with even hand in justice. White people owe it quite as much to themselves as the colored man to treat well the colored man who shows by his life that he deserves such treatment. And he goes on to say, there's no question of social equality, integration of the time, or Negro domination, also a racist buzzword of the time. Only the question of punishing bad men. Every colored man should realize that the worst enemy of his race is the Negro criminal. And above all, the Negro criminal who commits the dreadful crime of rape. And it should be felt as in the highest degree an offense against the whole country and against the colored race in particular. For a colored man to fail to help the officers of the law in hunting down with all possible earnestness and zeal every such infamous offender. So now, first of all, it is not true. People were lynched for all kinds of reasons. Actually, it usually was not an accusation of rape. It could be an accusation of theft. It could be an accusation of murder. It could be because someone was successful and the white community was jealous. It could be because someone didn't step off the sidewalk fast enough. It could be because the local community felt there had to be a lynching because there hadn't been one in a while. So all of these things were a cause of this terrorism that held sway in the country for decades. And it wasn't just Roosevelt, there were pleas for anti-lynching legislation, which never happened, ever. And the so-called good for Black people presidents, they didn't do it either. So it never happened. Now there are calls for anti-lynching bills, but it's a funny thing to me. What we consider lynchings now are committed by the police, not by individuals. But it's important to point out that despite desperate pleas from Black people, nothing was ever done. So it's so what was I going to say? Oh, so I just wanted to start out, just recap what I had said about Roosevelt, that he became president at a time, a pivotal moment in history. Reconstruction didn't really just die. We're always told the 1876 election, the election that was stolen by Rutherford B. Hayes, where he was given the presidency in exchange for taking federal troops out of the South. It's not quite true. There were people who lived on the goodwill of whites, even as Jim Crow took hold, even as discrimination became more rampant, even as lynch law reigned across the country. So we see a man who tried to have it both ways. And Roosevelt said after the firestorm, after the dinner of inviting Booker T. Washington to dinner, he said that it made reaction made him, he said, melancholy, because he said it just seemed like the right thing to do. And I suppose that's part of the noblesse oblige of someone of Roosevelt's position, that he could, while at the same time holding very racist beliefs, that he could reach out to this prominent, special Black person and see him as being different and violate that social norm that said there would be no race mixing, no social interaction, no social equality, as it was called at the time. But and that he would defend those Black people who were attacked for being in their positions. Crum, by the way, eventually became Taft appointed him ambassador to Liberia, which was a Black position for many years, Liberia being a country formed by a colonization scheme, and formerly enslaved people settled there in the United States, created this country. The capital is Monrovia after James Monroe. Although it's nothing to celebrate, it's just these colonization schemes were efforts to get Black people out of the United States. So when he had the opportunity, despite helping Minnie Cox, despite helping Crumb, when it came down to doing the right thing by Black people, he failed. He didn't just fail, he made himself an instrument of punishment for people who did not deserve it. And the men of the, now this happened in 1906, and obviously no one was alive in the 70s, but they were exonerated in the 70s by Richard Nixon. And there was one gentleman still alive, and he was given a settlement of $25,000. He was in his 90s though at the time. I don't even know how long he lived after receiving it. But I think the story of Parker is more emblematic of what life was like for Black people at that time, even though he was lionized initially by white people as well, that he died in such a terrible way. Booker T. Washington, McKinley did not die immediately. He was wounded and lived for some days after. Booker T. Washington said he rejoiced that a Black man had saved the president from death. And even one of the bodyguards who failed to protect McKinley said that colored man was quicker than we. He nearly killed the man. But then that same person during the trial said, I never saw no colored man in the whole fracas. So that was how his life went. And that was the plight of Black people then and now. I made a reference to Joe Biden. Biden was always one of the more conservative Democrats. And he was the point person against busing. And ironically, it was Kamala Harris who really made that point clear in one of the debates last year before he was, maybe it was 2019, she dropped out by 2020. So that was his history. He is one of the people he bragged about. I wrote the damn bill, he said, the crime bill of the 1990s from Bill Clinton, which increased the number of federal offenses that could send people, mostly Black people, to jail. And he bragged and he said, this bill has everything except the death penalty for jaywalking. And he thought that was very funny. And I'm assuming you know about the crazy, stupid story about the Black man named Corn Pop, and he had a fight with him at a pool when he was a lifeguard as a young man. And Black kids told him about roaches and were fascinated by the blonde hair on his legs. I mean, it was quite crazy. But I bring this up to say that this is the rule in American politics rather than the exception. So going president by president, I show how the foundations of anti-Black racism, first with the slaveholding presidents, 10 of the first 12 were slaveholders. Only the Adamses were father and son were not of that first group. Although John Adams himself was, talk about colonization schemes, he wanted to send free Black people out of the country. He defended Southerners. He said, I'm sure they want to end slavery. We shouldn't condemn them. And Black people will, even if they were freed, they would just starve to death or they would become criminals and they'd want to go back to their old masters and so forth. And even Lincoln, who's thought of as the great emancipator, he never gave up his dream of sending Black people out of the country. And after the Civil War, it was constant. Every 4 years, Black people hoping that a Republican would win, being afraid when a Democrat won. And it's been like that ever since. And of course, in the 60s, when the parties switched, I mean, it was, there were always some Black Republicans. Jackie Robinson was a Republican. Martin Luther King was originally a Republican. That was not unusual in the 50s, even into the early 60s, but with the civil rights movement that, and Lyndon Johnson being the president who shepherded through under demand, under duress from a mass movement, the Democrats became the Black People's Party. Although that did not happen overnight, there were still some Democrats elected in the South, even into the 90s, people like Bill Clinton or Al Gore, although that doesn't happen very much anymore. So Theodore, all that to say, Theodore Roosevelt is part of a larger story of the presidents and Black people, using Black people as an electoral foil, doing things that were terribly wrong in order to secure votes and support from white America. And we're still living with this legacy. We're living with this legacy now. So I will stop sharing. And so that's, I don't want to say that's everything about Roosevelt or everything in the book, but those are I think the most important points. And but I want to say one more thing about presidents in general and people who are respected and admired. I think it's important to tell the truth about them. You know, in the last year, we have had debates about taking down statues, and there's a kerfuffle now in San Francisco about they want to change the name of like dozens of schools overnight. And I wanted to read a quote from you about from Donald Trump. In 2017, I'm sure you remember in Charlottesville, Virginia, what started as an effort to protest the removal of a monument dedicated to Robert E. Lee. There was a march of Trump supporters. A woman was killed. And the issue of monuments and statues was raised. And Trump said, George Washington was a slave owner. So will George Washington lose his statue? Are we going to take down statues of Washington? How about Thomas Jefferson? He was a slave owner too. Are we going to take down his statue? And the New York Times had a survey of readers, and a mere 4% of them approved of removing statues of Washington or Jefferson. But so it is a struggle to be truthful, for people to embrace, many people to embrace the truth. But I believe we have to start. We have to start somewhere. And tonight we're talking about Theodore Roosevelt, but I think we can have, while the details will be different for each man, we could have the same conversation about the 45 other presidents. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Margaret. And having read large portions of your book, I haven't read every single word, I have to confess, but your book goes through every president in similar detail, the way you just laid out Theodore Roosevelt's record on race. I have to ask, how, before I'm going to turn this over to Michaela in a second, but I have to ask about the research process of finding the stories, because they aren't ones I shouldn't, at the TR inaugural site, I probably have a little bit more TR knowledge, but a lot of people don't know these stories. Were these stories hard to find?
No,
Okay.
Research is hard to do, but it's interesting. The information just leapt out at me. It's not hard to find. It's not like in some secret archive. And I think it speaks to the determination to defend these people, to defend these men. And so it's easy to find out what he said about the men at Brownsville. It's easy to find out all of it. What I just said that, John Adams had said, and the fact that Harry Truman was used the N-word very frequently, was a segregationist his entire life. That Bill Clinton, I mean, it's easier for modernists because it's something I've actually lived through, that he campaigned by executing a mentally disabled Black man, by using Black prisoners as a prop to prove he was tough on crime. All these things, if you look just a little bit, if you're looking for it, you see it. So the question becomes, why don't people present this information, which is so easy to find? I think biographers and scholars, they write about people who they admire. And I think they are loath to present anything that puts them in a negative light. So I think it's an attachment to the individual, but I think it's an attachment to the larger project, to wanting to say positive things about the country. And if you reveal this information, there's then what? Do we not believe in the things we say about this nation? It's a great country. We've achieved so much, and so on and so forth. So, but I also say that omissions are lies just as much as telling a falsehood. I think omissions are lies as well. And it's a great book I want to recommend is Lies My Teacher Told Me by James Lowen, which goes through the process of monuments and signage across the country. And he dissects all the things that are, well, those are outright lies, but omissions are also lies. So if you talk about Lincoln being anti-slavery, sort of, but you don't mention that he wanted the country for white people and wanted to send Black people away, then you're telling a lie, because you can't call him the great emancipator.
All right, thank you. All right, I'm going to turn this over to Michaela from the Niagara Falls Underground Railroad Heritage Center to moderate our Q&A. Folks, feel free to our audience, feel free to add questions to the Q&A or the chat, and take it away, Michaela. Thank you.
All right. So Lenora actually asked the question that I had. So I'm going to go with some of the questions in our Q&A box. So we have one from John Olson, and is, how do you judge Roosevelt on the issues of race in the context of his time?
Well, in the context of his time, well, he was a man of his time. Actually, I suppose you could say he was better than some people. There were many white people who wouldn't have even invited Booker T. Washington to dinner. But that was a segment of Roosevelt's class, upper class Northern Republicans, who could say that, this particular person was a good Negro and was worthy of being protected or defended. So he was very much a person of his time. And that's the question that's always asked when we reveal this information about people. Well, at that time, what were people like? But there were always people who fought against racism, who fought against injustice. And they were people of their time as well. So within the context of his class, within the context of being a politician, he was a person of his time. And he knew the fact that he would defend those few people and that he would keep in touch with Booker T. Washington. He had to have known that it was wrong to discharge the men of the 25th Regiment. But he never said otherwise, and made sure that Foraker, who lost his political career because he was so angry with him for defying him, for being so public in his denunciations.
Okay, thank you. So John actually had another question, and it's, Buffalo's own Grover Cleveland, when elected the first time, was the first Democrat after a long stretch Republican. What was his record on race?
Well, let me see. I'm going to cheat a little bit and look him up. He was the first Democrat elected when he was elected in 1884. There was great celebration in the South and great mourning among Black people that he had won. But he was one of the proponents. There was a Civil Rights Act which passed in the Reconstruction era. The Supreme Court threw it out, and there were efforts to bring it back into force. But one of his campaign slogans was "No force bill, no Negro domination in the South." So this Civil Rights Act was called the Force Bill, like forced busing. The word force kept coming up, and called it an atrocious measure. And the legislation especially menaces the welfare and prosperity of the South. But then he would, in his public statements, he would say, let's see, all discussion of their fitness. It was a weird statement. All discussion as to their fitness for the place accorded to them as American citizens is idle and unprofitable, except as it suggests the necessity for their improvement, which is sort of a backhanded kind of compliment. He picked Southern segregationists for his cabinet, but Frederick Douglass had a position as recorder of deeds, and Cleveland asked for his resignation. But so that's what he was in his first term. And let's see. So Democrats controlled both houses of Congress in his second term. And the notorious Plessy versus Ferguson decision was handed down during his second term. That was the case from Louisiana, a Black man named Homer Plessy, who sued because he was sued the railways because of segregated accommodations. And Cleveland said nothing about it at all. So, and then Booker T. Washington gave his compromise speech. And Cleveland said to Washington in a letter, "Your words cannot fail to delight and encourage all who wish well for your race. And if your colored fellow citizens do not favor your utterances, gather new hope and form new determination to gain every valuable advantage offered them by their citizenship, it will be strange indeed." So that was Cleveland. He was definitely a Democrat of that day.
Okay, thank you. So Janice asked, you mentioned Truman being a segregationist. How does his integration of the military fit with that?
Well, it's strange. There was we like to think that there was only one civil rights effort in late 50s, early 60s, but that's not true. There were demands for action for decades. And Truman was trying to win in 1948. As we all know, he won by a very narrow margin. So much so that there was one newspaper that said Dewey had won instead of Truman, now famous photograph. But someone on Truman's team had advised him that he needed to get Black votes the only place Black people could vote in the North. And so desegregating the military was seen as a way to make that happen. Eisenhower at the time, I point out, Eisenhower was opposed to desegregating the military. But Truman, you ask about Truman, there's a funny, interesting, not like humorous quote from him. When in 1960, when sit-ins swept the segregated South, Truman declared that he wouldn't countenance such behavior in a business he owned, thereby admitting that he would run a segregated business. Quote, "If anyone came into my store and tried to stop business, I'd throw him out. The Negro should behave himself and show he's a good citizen. Common sense and goodwill can solve this thing. We've done it in Missouri. And the Detroit branch of the NAACP asked him about his remark. He replied, "Your telegram regarding the statement which I made about sit-downs in the restaurant is correct. I would do just what I said." And then he added, "This is not personal nor confidential." So you could, he was telling them they were free to repeat his words. He was from Missouri. He came from a family, his grandparents on both sides were slaveholding. He was a Klansman. He joined the Klan as a young man. He later on, he told us the weird story. He claimed he was threatened, and he didn't really want to join the Klan. Somebody told him that he had to join. The Klan was very popular in the 20s all over the country, and Truman was a Klan member briefly as a young person.
Oh, wow. Thank you for that.
Mm-hmm.
So Diane wants to know, well, she says, truth is important and it's clear that all of our presidents were flawed. How do we incorporate this into the history of our country and have a balanced view? How do we move forward as a united country?
Well, I think we unite by being truthful. You can talk about, my book is specifically about the president's relations with Black people, so none of them come out looking very good. But I think we just have to be honest and strive for that. And you can give credit where it's due. I'm not saying that you can never do that, but I think we get unity. It's a funny thing now that Biden's president and people are trying to overcome their Trump trauma, and everyone's unity. He's got to heal the country. Well, my answer to that is he's got to do the right thing. He's got to help people. Then you have unity, you have healing, you have a country where people communicate with truth and by making amends. And it could be reparations. It could be strengthening civil rights laws. It can be raising the minimum wage. It has never been this low before. And for Biden to not say, and by the way, the plan he discussed was only to raise a minimum wage, which is now $7.50 an hour, the federal minimum wage, although it varies around the country, to raise it to $15 an hour in 4 or 5 years. I mean, $15 is inadequate now, but that's how you bring unity. That's how you bring a country where people can be mutually respectful of one another by doing the right thing and trying to undo the bad things.
Thank you. So Stanton wants to know, are there any presidents or a single president that strikes you as more enlightened than others in terms of their relations with race?
It's a tough question. It's they were all lacking in some way. I guess the issue is, who was least bad. In the modern era, I don't even know what to say. They all fell short when it was politicians are generally not rewarded for doing the right thing. They tend to be rewarded for not doing the right thing. The special interests, the rich people who tell them what to do, the history of racism, all of these things, the dynamics pushes them in the direction of not doing the right thing. It's the people who push them into doing the right things, and those things which we call good and positive happen because the people are the ones who make demands. I mean, everything. For example, Nixon gave us the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, but that was because you're too young to know this, but anyway, maybe you do know it, but I was a kid when the first Earth Day started, and pollution was a big issue, and there were protests that attracted millions of people. I mean, I'm not exaggerating. And there was a movement. They targeted members of Congress for defeat and defeated them. And that's why you have an environmental protection agency, because of the people. You have civil rights legislation because of the people. And you have to have, I'm not going to tell people not to be involved in electoral politics, not to vote, but that can't be the only thing that we do when we want to make change. There has to be organized mass movement and demands made. And when that happens, that's when the people are most likely to get what they need. So even if they start out being enlightened, their ambition, I think, even those who may want to do the right thing, Rutherford B. Hayes at first, because he had lost the election in 1876. And he said, I feel badly for and he was a Republican, the poor colored people of the South. And this lasted for a few weeks. And then when it was clear he could be president, if he withdrew federal troops, then he changed his tune. He was like, up, all's right with the world. So here's someone who started out perhaps with good intentions, who nevertheless, when the rubber met the road, did what was expedient for his political career.
Okay, thank you. So a question that I actually have is, when you were writing the book, who was your intended audience? Were you thinking that this would be a book taught in college classes, or would it just be something that anyone, regardless of their academic background, could read?
I wanted it to be something that did both of those things. I wanted anyone who had an interest in history to be able to read it, but I also hoped that it would be in college curricula, and it is. I'm happy that there are people who are teaching the book in college courses. I think a lot of people are interested in history. I don't think give people enough credit for wanting to be better informed. So I was hoping that people from every background, every race would want to read the book. But of course, people who have that interest in American history and in Black history, that in particular, they would find the book appealing.
Okay, thank you. And I have another question from John. It is, of all the presidents, excluding Obama, which president do you believe did the most for African Americans in America, or Blacks in America?
Excluding Obama. So, well, Obama didn't do a lot for Black people. He got a pass. Black people were so happy. There was so much racism against him. A lot of the opposition to him was racist. But he, whenever he was asked about Black people and doing anything for Black people, he would always say, I'm everybody's president, a rising tide lifts all boats. So if I, increase employment, that helps everybody. That helps Black people as well as white people. So what he did for Black people was more of a good feeling. It was a psychological improvement, that people were so happy, so proud, and still are, to see him in that position. Inauguration day, people went on and on about Michelle Obama's outfit, which was amazing. It was lovely. But, and I know people said they cried, still cry when I see them. And, it was a huge thing to see a Black person in that position. But, and there were other Black people who got those positions, and that's another problem, that the desire to see a Black face in a high place, that's born of the history of Jim Crow and segregation. We're still, the first Black person to do this or that. Kamala Harris, she doesn't have anything to brag about. She was another one who put a lot of people in jail, and she was a prosecutor, and prosecutors are going to prosecute. They advance themselves politically by putting people in jail. She wasn't any different in that regard. So yes, she's the first female vice president, first vice president of color. But if we get this double talk about when they were campaigning for those 2 Senate seats in Georgia, that $2,000 will go right out the door. I'm referring to the stimulus payments. Well, now it's not 2,000, it was 600. So they subtracted 600 from 2,000 and now it's $1,400, which is a pittance when you think about the tax cuts for rich people and the military spending. But that's what we get. The people have to be the ones in the driver's seat, and we have to make politicians in this country aren't afraid of us. They're not afraid of the people. In other places they may be, but not here. So that's why we don't have enough presidents who of whom it can be said that they were quote unquote good for Black people. It's too often cheap praise, in my opinion.
So I have another question. It is, what is the most surprising, either good or bad thing that you discovered when writing the book?
The most surprising thing I discovered was that, I was always taught that Lincoln, that he initially said he wanted to send Black people out of the country, but he changed his mind. He never said it again. He never gave up. He tied emancipation to colonization. There was a short, brief colony that existed off the coast of Haiti, and a couple hundred people were sent there. And that was his experiment. He had an office of colonization. Somebody had a job. That was their job. Even a couple of weeks before he was assassinated, he said to Benjamin Butler, who had been a Union general, to come up with the plan to send Black people out of the country. He proposed giving reparations to the South, the people responsible for causing the Civil War. I did not know that. I knew he was not, as advertised, but I did not have that information. That was the biggest surprise to me. But just the depth of the other thing was George Washington. I knew he was a slaveholder. He and his wife, Martha, was the one. She and her first husband, Custis, owned a couple hundred people. They were huge slave owners. And the first capital of the United States was in New York. Washington was inaugurated there. Then it moved further south to Philly. Then it moved further south to this new city. The purpose of creating a capital, building a new city in the South, was to make sure that slavery was physically protected by being in that region of the country. And when Washington was in Philadelphia, he had a problem because Pennsylvania had a law which said that any enslaved person in the state for, I believe it was 6 months, could sue for their freedom. And he certainly didn't want that to happen. So he rotated people. So he didn't keep them in Philadelphia for 6 months. He sent them back to Mount Vernon. He and his wife went to great pains. One young woman managed to escape, and he never gave up trying to recapture her. Just one person out of 200. So those were the things that were a surprise to me.
Okay, thank you for that. So in a similar vein, during your research, were there any interactions that presidents had that shocked you or intrigued you, their interactions regarding people of color or African Americans?
Yeah, John Kennedy, he met Martin Luther. The first time he met Martin Luther King, he met him in secret because Kennedy was a Democrat. That, as I said, was the party of the segregated South. He, especially his brother Bobby, did not want to be seen as being too close to Black people. So the first time he met King, it was a secret meeting. They didn't announce that King was coming to the White House. But it was the people who pushed Kennedy first and then Johnson. So I love those little anecdotes. That's something I always loved about history.
Oh, wow, thank you. So another question that I have is, why is it important for us as a country to have an understanding of history from the Black perspective?
I think we need it from many perspectives. But I think racism, anti-Black racism, is something that has driven so many things in this country, from laws that are still on the books, there are states that, the state of Oregon, for example, there are very few Black people. That's because there was a law that was only taken off the books in a referendum a few years ago that said Black people couldn't move to Oregon. Redlining, the fact that there are political parties which de facto are white parties and Black parties, all of these things that tells you how did the South go from being, they used to call themselves yellow dog Democrats. They would vote for a yellow dog, meaning they would vote for a yellow dog before they'd vote for a Republican. So this region went from being solidly Democratic to over time becoming solidly Republican. And the issue was race. Why was there an explosion in the prison population after the early 70s? And I wrote an article a couple of years ago, and I found out that when Martin Luther King was alive, there were only like 600,000 people in jail in the late 60s. Now there are more than 2 million. So these are, so the effort was, if Jim Crow had to be taken off the books, there was going to be a way to keep Black people under control. So it's things like that have an impact on everybody's life, all of our lives. I was thinking the other day about, there's still a handful of states, mostly in the South, that did not accept the Obamacare Medicaid expansion. And there's states with large Black populations. And everybody suffers. So these states, they go without money. White people, I'm sure, could use the Medicaid expansion, but they didn't take it because it was seen as the Black people's insurance. Many things like that.
Okay, thank you so much. We don't have any more questions unless an attendee wants to drop something in. But other than that, I think we're done with the Q&A session.
All right, thank you both, Michaela and Margaret. I am actually going to, if anyone is interested in getting a copy of Margaret's book, which I will say is very readable and had plenty of footnotes to warm the cockles of my nerdy heart. I just chatted out a link to, you can purchase it through Buffalo's own favorite independent bookstore, Talking Leaves Books. And if you do that, actually Talking Leaves has agreed to donate a portion of the proceeds back to the organizations who are sponsoring this evening's program. So if anyone is interested in that.
And thank you. I always try to promote independent bookstores. I always ask people, buy from independent bookstores. So I'm glad you have one to direct people to.
Talking Leaves is wonderful. And the next time you're in town, well, you'll have to stop by. Anyway, Margaret,
just to point this out, my book was published last February 4th. So I had like 6 weeks not even like 5 weeks before everything started to shut down. I was trying to promote a book in a pandemic. And I think I had 7 or 8 events, and then that was it. So I look forward to the day when I can, for many reasons,
yes,
I can go places and talk about that.
I think all of us are looking forward to that day, certainly. But Margaret, this was wonderful. Again, I learned a lot from your book, and appreciate you talking about TR at the site. We try to be honest, and we don't, when we redid our interpretation a few years ago, we said, what, we are not going to just be this, TR was the best. We know he had faults, and we do our best to be honest about them. So we certainly appreciate the perspective you brought to this. For the folks who are joining us, I do want to just put in a plug, though, for our next speaker night. It'll be on the 4th Tuesday of March, which is March 23rd. And in honor of Women's History Month, we're pleased to be working with Sagamore Hill National Historic Site and the Friends of Sagamore Hill to bring everyone a presentation called Behind Every Great Man is a Great Woman, the Women Who Influenced TR. Our speaker will be Laura Cinturati, who is a museum technician at Sagamore Hill. She's been to our speaker night before. Folks might remember her talk about the Great War and the Roosevelt family. Similarly, I just sent a link out in the chat where people can get their tickets or register for March 23rd. But again, Margaret, we appreciate you being here. We appreciate all of the work you have done. Thanks to the Buffalo Presidential Center and the Niagara Falls Underground Railroad Museum as well. And Margaret, if you're ever in Buffalo, I hope you look us up because we would love to.
I can't wait till I can get out of New York, out of New York City and see places. I do look forward to it. Thank you so much, Lenora. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you, Linda. Thank you, Michaela. Thank you, Travis. Thank you all. I had a blast.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.